Thank you for joining the FCC's Regulatory Agenda of 2013 panel. I am joined by a full panel this year of FCC commissioners. Right after the FCC chairman's Q&A, we have some things to discuss, it seems. Commissioner Robert McDowell is on my left, on your right immediately. He is the Republican, senior Republican commissioner. Mignon Clyburn, Jessica Rosenworcel, and Ajit Pai. Thank you for joining us today. There's a lot to be discussed, so maybe we can just get straight into it. There was an announcement by the FCC chairman just a few minutes ago about a plan to release unlicensed spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band. Would love to get initial impressions and how you feel about it, support, any concerns, and we'll start with you, Commissioner McDowell.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. Glad to see we have plenty of attendance. And I've got double duty today, so right after this panel is one on UN regulation of the internet, so don't leave those chairs. But I was unable actually to see the chairman's speech due to a scheduling conflict, but it's not only is it a good idea in the 5 gigahertz band, but it's the law. And so Congress told us we should do this, and so it's terrific if we get going on it as soon as possible. I've been a long time proponent of unlicensed use of, for instance, the television white spaces. We are now coming up on the 11th anniversary of the launching of that. And every year, I think it'll be the next CES we start seeing white spaces devices being debuted, but unfortunately it's taken a while. So it's good to go forward on this, and I think it'll be very, very valuable. It'll take a few years before we actually do see prototypes on the floor here, but it'll be a lot of fun once we do see it going.
Commissioner Clyburn?
I think that announcement and all of the other discussions that we will have for me and for all of us, it's just an affirmation of all of the above approach that we have in terms of getting spectrum to market. We recognize all of the incredible benefits that we see on the floor in terms of the potential, when we talk about Wi-Fi and, Bluetooth and the like. And again, it's what is needed. It is forward thinking, and I'm looking forward to what's to come, what's next to come.
And Commissioner Rosenworcel?
So I'm just going to echo my colleagues. I think it's terrific news. We'll be looking at the 5 gigahertz band. We have a duty to do that under the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. I'm glad we're going to get started. As a general matter, unlicensed is just such a terrific and growing part of our economy. Already it contributes between $16 and $37 billion annually to our economy. And sometimes I think we get a little bit wonkish when we discuss it. I think it's easier if you actually ask people, have they ever used a television remote control? And if you've ever used a garage door opener when you go home, or if you've ever used a baby monitor or a cordless phone or used Wi-Fi, you've used unlicensed. It's powering our whole economy. And increasingly, as we move towards an Internet of Things, it's going to power more and more of our devices. So it's really important for the Commission to look at all sorts of different spectrum bands to make sure that there's adequate unlicensed that can power all of those devices and power our economy as well.
And Commissioner Pai?
I'll join the chorus in echoing my excitement about the chairman's announcement. I'm especially bullish about unlicensed Wi-Fi in the 5 gigahertz band because of the technical properties of that particular swath of spectrum. Number one, we are talking about very wide contiguous channels of 160, 180, maybe even 200 megahertz. We are also talking about propagation of wavelengths which is relatively short, which minimizes the potential for interference. When you combine those things, what you get is a very powerful unlicensed, potential for unlicensed applications, very high throughput. On the floor, I looked at the Qualcomm booth, for example. They have an 802.11ac standard chip, which is the IEEE approved standard for 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. And if you look at the throughput that they're able to achieve, 300 megabits per second wirelessly, that is tremendous. And so we're talking about a magnitude order of difference in terms of what will be potentially commercially available for consumers across this country in terms of unlicensed services and devices. So I'm very excited about the announcement and look forward to working with my colleagues to make it a reality.
When would this be a reality? When would the folks here at CES and consumers writ large be able to feel the difference in their Wi-Fi connections on their devices with this plan in order? Anybody want to speak up on that?
So that's an excellent question, which I'm not sure there's a concrete answer to. I think maybe can all agree as soon as possible would be a great answer. I've been through a couple of iterations of the TV white spaces, as you've covered over the years, and we've always hoped that those would be sooner rather than later, and they're still not there yet. So I hope now that we have the certainty from Congress and the statute that will enable us to get it done as soon as possible. We do have a timeline suggested in the statute as well, but in terms of actually, to answer your question more directly, when is it in the hands of consumers? We hope as soon as possible, but these things do tend to be measured in years. So we hope it's on the shorter end of 5 years rather than the longer end.
Shorter end of 5 years? Does that seem plausible, between 3 to 5 years?
Given all of the innovation and the impetus in what we're seeing here, I am confident that we will be on the shorter end of that.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
I think the sooner that we put rules in place, the sooner that there's certainty out there for consumers, for manufacturers. And so I think we should double down on our efforts to make sure that we have rules out there so that the industry can respond and consumers can see the benefit.
I would simply say that 3 to 5 years is possible, but to me, at least, I would like to see it much sooner than that.
I even recognizing a lot of people here in the crowd are a lot of people here actually from Washington, and I wonder, folks, for new commissioners here, as you're walking the floor and talking to people outside of Washington, what if you told them is the most important thing you can do at the FCC to make their lives and their businesses as innovators better?
Ensuring that the rules, ensuring that our policies are in sync with the times. I think it's important for us to come to these conferences and have this engagement, to make sure that as much as possible that we're in tune and in line. It's very difficult from a regulatory standpoint, but that is the most important. So if there's not any engagement and communications, then policy and progress will not sync up.
And what specifically does that mean? When people, I think if the folks here are pretty sophisticated when they know about that there are certain rules that are being considered right now. Are you talking specifically about the incentive auctions? Are you talking about competition policy? Talking about handset roaming? What are you talking about?
We're talking about auction, our traditional framework in terms of getting traditional auctions, in terms of auction sharing and those type of the H-band. We're talking about the dynamic spectrum of white spaces and the like. So we're talking about all of some people would call it the legacy framework, and the more innovative frameworks in terms of getting spectrum to market.
Maybe Commissioner Pai, since it looks like you're grabbing the mic, let me ask you specifically, what one specific policy goal do you think could be a facilitator for this crowd here in 2013, an important one, the top priority for you?
Well, I hate to dodge the question by giving you two, but if I had to, I would say spectrum and the IP transition. Spectrum, of course, we've discussed a little bit in the context of 5 gigahertz, incentive auctions, which the chairman discussed, of course. I think all of us are on the same page in the sense that we agree that the commission needs to take action sooner rather than later to bring more usable spectrum into the commercial marketplace for mobile broadband. The IP transition is absolutely critical, too. We are quickly approaching the point where the legacy regulations that were developed for the copper era, where you had monopoly providers supplying voice services, very outmoded. And so in a competitive all IP world, what is the role of FCC regulation? Which of the economic regulations should we export to the IP world? Which should we jettison? Which of the consumer protections should we apply to the IP world, and which are less important? Those are the important questions that we are going to have to answer, and I'm pleased that the chairman late last year announced the formation of the Technology Transitions Policy Task Force, which will try to identify what the important policy priorities are, identify what the regulations that are or are not necessary are, and then spur the Commission to action. This is one of the central questions the Commission is going to be tackling this year, and I'm hopeful that we can reach resolution by the end of the year.
So, from a more macro perspective, I think it's important on the wireless side of things to not overly encumber spectrum with conditions, not to have us try to guess what uses there might be for particular frequencies. This is something I've learned through experience at the Commission, but also just studying the history of the Commission. We don't know what's coming over the horizon. A lot has happened in my 6.5 years on the Commission in terms of the dawn of the smartphone era, tablets and all the rest of it. None of that was contemplated when I was sworn in June of '06, at least not contemplated by policymakers. Certainly engineers had been working on it for quite some time. So we don't know what's coming over the horizon. We don't know what new uses for certain frequencies might be thought of as we go forward. So I think it's important for us to have flexible use policies for spectrum. And to kind of build on what Commissioner Pai was saying, more generally, I think we need to be more aggressive in terms of every year auditing our rules to see what could be discarded. And I would hope, and as I've testified before Congress many times, I also would hope that our colleagues in Congress would start to take a really hard look at a comprehensive rewrite of our communications laws and really look at things from the perspective of consumers. You know, I look at this world through the eyes of my kids, and when they receive or transmit content, they're not concerned whether it goes over coaxial cable or the airwaves in one way or the airwaves in another way or fiber or copper, but the law makes those differences. It treats those transmissions differently. And that, I think, is starting to create artificial incentives and disincentives, distortions in the marketplace due to inconsistent treatments of technologies. So let's start looking at it through the eyes of consumers. Where is there consumer harm? But we're going to need a statutory rewrite. In the meantime, there are things that we can start to do within the confines of the statute that we're given to start to clear out a lot of unnecessary underbrush and rules that are outdated. You know, we have hundreds of thousands of words in the Code of Federal Regulations under our section of it, and I think we could probably modernize a great portion of that.
Can you actually be a little more specific about some of those rules that could be discarded? Have you been, you know, when you talk to the crowd here, you tell them as we go through this IP transition that there's some things that just don't make sense, for example, X?
Well, you know, when it comes to IP transition, I want to thank Commissioner Pai for his leadership on this issue. So in terms of that in particular, I'll let him speak to some of the specifics he's talked about because I don't want to steal his thunder there. But I think there's a tremendous amount that could be done. I mean, you know, for instance, when it came to the 700 megahertz auction with the C block, I saw the world becoming more open anyway in wireless thanks to some unlicensed use of wireless as the sort of the escape valve and the check and the balance. So encumbrances like that actually can end up having harmful, distorting byproducts. And if you look at the 700 megahertz auction, you had the encumbrance on the C block driving some deeper pocketed bidders into the A and B blocks, which it was thought that they would be homes for smaller players, but the prices were driven up, and there's evidence in the record that demonstrates this. So the smaller players were actually driven out. Also, that encumbrance in the C block was put there to try to attract a new entrant, in particular Google. And Google did not bid beyond 77 cents per megahertz pop, which is 1/3 of the price of the A and the B block. So all of this sort of complex Rube Goldberg type design just didn't work, and that's the kind of thing we can clear out or just not do to begin with.
Commissioner Rosen, did you want to add to that? Your thoughts?
Well, let me speak about it at a high level. When you started, you asked, what would you say to people on the floor? And I think when it comes to the role of the FCC, it's one of how do we inspire confidence? That has two components. How do we inspire confidence so that companies have the certainty they need to invest in communications infrastructure and services? And the second piece is how do we inspire confidence so that consumers can take full advantage of those services and all the bounty of the digital age? I think with respect to the first, inspiring confidence involves things like putting our auction rules out early and on a timeline so we can inspire the formation of capital and participation in our auctions. I think that involves making clear our rules about unlicensed policy. And as we've been talking about, it also involves making clear how we're going to approach the transition from the public switch telephone network to the IP era. I think with respect to consumers, we can always do a better job trying to explain to consumers how these services can help them, how they can use them, and make sure that they are satisfied with all these new ways they have of connected behavior and the connected world we live in.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, you mentioned consumers, and I wonder how you all on the panel feel that the FCC has done in consumer protection and that role, and what specific over your tenure, some shorter and some longer, but also going forward, what you think the role of the FCC should be in terms of bills, in terms of monitoring how carriers charge. Data caps has been an issue. And whoever would like to start, Commissioner?
In terms of forever being encouragers of competition, forever being proponents of transparency, you know, those types of clear, high-level, flexible rules of the road to me are key. Because as Commissioner Rosenworcel, put forth, certainty is beneficial both to the innovators on the floor and the consumers and regulators. And so, if we put forth that and are in tune with that, then we have greater and continual opportunities for a smoother and productive and robust engagement.
And how do you think we've done, that you've done, I should say, not me, the FCC?
I give us a B+. There is room for improvement, and we are attempting to do that through our consumer division engagement. All of us individually and collectively are on the road informing consumers about some of the basic applications and some trying to drill down what some of these policies and decisions and what these things mean for everyday consumer engagement. We are speaking, and we'll probably speak more about that in terms of communities that have been that this engagement has not been as beneficial, those with disabilities and the like. We're doing some incredible things in terms of outreach and policy making, implementing CDAA to bridge those gaps by way of services, particularly communication services. So we're being sort of, I guess, regulatory evangelists, if you will allow me to say that, to have that engagement and to ensure through this robust engagement that we're listening to people, listening to innovators, listening to those in the industry to ensure that our policies and our decision making is in sync with the way and the outcomes that we know are best for this nation.
And you else want to take a stab at it?
You know, at the risk of stating the obvious, I think this is a great question because we're at the Consumer Electronics Show.
Yes.
It is first in the title, and it should be first in everything we do. The Commission right now has a complaint process. We take in a lot of complaints from consumers who sometimes don't understand the services they sign up for and the contracts that they sign their names on. And we were just looking at the data. We got about 380,000 complaints and inquiries in the last year for which we have data. I don't think that number is necessarily demonstrative of a bad job on the part of any service provider. I think what it demonstrates is that these devices are so much more important to the way we live right now. And the numbers clearly show that. On average, households spend about 4% of their budget on communications devices right now. That's thousands of dollars a year. They get a lot more value from them. We expect to be connected wherever we go. We get more programming than ever before. But it's important that we also make sure that consumers feel like they're being treated fairly. So I think the agency can do more with the consumer complaint data it collects. And I think we should also be sharing that a little bit more broadly with industry and consumers, because if we identify trends, that's something that can inform our policies. And at the same time, it might be useful data for industries to identify where there are gaps in the consumer experience that can be addressed.
So, one area I think where we can be helpful is to help identify trouble spots. And so, as Commissioner Rosenworcel was just saying, and Commissioner Clyburn as well, consumers come to us and file complaints, and we hear from them, and that gives us a telltale or a bit of a passive sonar buoy in terms of listening to what's going on in the marketplace. But I think where we can then pivot is to work with industry and consumer groups on trying to forge, private sector solutions to a lot of these issues, whether it's on things like bill shock, for instance. I think that could be more positive, more constructive, and more effective than us coming up with ex-ante rulemaking process, not taking into account all the realities and unforeseen contingencies that can happen in the marketplace. I think it would also work with something like 700 megahertz interoperability, and I've stated that since the beginning of that issue. I do hope industry comes up with a solution to that as soon as possible before the government tries to, because I don't know that we'll do a better job than industry will on that point. But in the past, in a variety of contexts, children's advertising on television, for instance, a lot of different ways, when the Commission has worked with industry and consumer groups to forge a voluntary private sector solution, I think that works well. And I'm not talking about big regulatory nudges here. I'm talking about actually a collaborative, cooperative effort that produces the best results sometimes.
With these voluntary efforts, though, I've got to say, as a reporter, I get a lot of reader comments from consumers saying that they have no clue what their carriers are doing, to be honest. What be landline, wireless, whatever it is, and they always wonder, like, where are these fees coming up? And then you hear every once in a while about an enforcement action at the FCC. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your view on how the FCC acts as an enforcer of consumer protection, if the resources are there, if they're doing their job, if there is more to be done on billing and consumer protection specifically.
There's a price to being the most junior member of the panel. I think in general, at least in my experience over the past 8 months, we've done a reasonably good job at adjudicating complaints that have been brought before us. Let me just give you one example. We had a situation in which a provider was essentially targeting immigrant populations and charging them exorbitant fees for the use of certain prepaid calling services. Almost explicitly, their business plan was to prey on these populations because they knew they were very unlikely to complain. Well, fortunately, some of them did. And it was a pleasure, I think I speak for my colleagues when I say that the FCC's role in that situation exemplified the consumer protection function that we have under the Communications Act. We made an accurate assessment of liability, and we tried to calibrate the penalty against that provider in order to deter them, both to punish them for what they did and to deter any other providers who were thinking about doing the same from engaging in similar conduct. The flip side to exercising good judgment as an enforcer, I would add, is trying to make the law clear in cases where the consumer interest is not implicated. What do I mean by that? Well, we recently faced a question under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act as to whether confirmation texts that providers would send after you opted out from future communications could serve as the basis of a class action lawsuit against a provider. So if you didn't want to get any more emails from Twitter or American Express and you opted out and they sent you an email back or a text back, would that serve as the basis of legal liability? Companies across this country have been sued, faced class action lawsuits on the basis of this behavior. When the consumer protection not only wasn't implicated, we found that consumers actually benefited from getting these confirmation texts. We hadn't received any complaints about these texts or emails being sent. We had received complaints when they weren't. So we simply clarified under the TCPA that there was no legal liability, and that was a pro-consumer effort, which didn't necessarily involve the enforcement of a particular complaint. It was just simply saying what the law was to make the playing field understandable to both provide consumers and to companies. So there's a double-edged sword when it comes to consumer protection. We have to obviously take action where action is warranted, and we need to make clear what the rules of the road are in cases where the consumer interest is not implicated.
And another thing that that I know that the joint engagement that we have with our state counterparts, that type of dialogue is definitely beneficial because we're, from a jurisdictional standpoint, where our hours begins and theirs ends or vice versa, which that might mean the same thing what I just said. Anyway, where things begin and end, to try to, and it is our goal to have as much of a seamless consumer protection engagement as possible, and I think that dialogue between state and federal regulators is important and is the one that we are continually building on through the joint board process and other relationships.
Thank you. Switching gears, post Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of questions raised as to sort of responsibility of the failure of communication networks. And I wonder what your thoughts are, any lessons learned, the role of the regulator at the FCC in ensuring that there is that kind of communication network failure, that kind of communications network does not happen again. What is the role of the FCC?
You know, Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast only a few months ago, but the images, I can't seem to let go of them myself, from the flooding that we saw in New York to the fires that we saw at the edge of the water, and whole towns along the New Jersey shore that have been decimated. What we learned in the aftermath of that storm is that 1/4 of the wireless towers in the affected area were not capable of providing service. That's disturbing, because we know now that we have many households, in fact, about 1/3 of the households in this country are wireless only. So many of us find that our lives are controlled by our smartphones. But one difficult event like this, and we're suddenly all turned into wireless teetotalers. And when we need to make calls most, unfortunately, sometimes that's when networks work least. So in the aftermath of this storm, I called for us to have what I called an honest accounting of the resiliency of our nation's infrastructure. I think that's got two pieces to it. First, we need to understand what it means when more consumers migrate from traditional copper lines to wireless phones and to IP services. We're more reliant than ever on commercial power. We need to know how that affects our networks when the unthinkable occurs. And then second, I think there's a consumer component to this too. We've been told whenever a disaster is coming or difficult weather, we should make sure we have water, and you watch everyone run to the grocery store and buy their canned food. I think at the same time, we should be thinking about how consumers have backup chargers and solar-powered batteries and the like, so that their devices continue to have the opportunity to work, even if you don't have commercial power at home. I should add that our chairman, to his great credit, has said that we will hold a series of hearings in the coming months on disaster preparedness, network resiliency, and these issues, and I think I'm very pleased about it. I'm sure my colleagues are as well.
Oh, and let's not forget about what we've learned and what we will issue through a report. I believe before the end of the week, as it relates to derecho, 2 million users during that catastrophe were unable to call 911. We have got some significant issues that I think, like I said, the report will be reflective of, and the commissioner is correct. Where there are those deficiencies, we have to address them through a robust and resilient framework, and that, of course, is the goal of all of us.
I think it's important to point out, I was in the private sector when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, and was part of the effort on the private sector side to work with the commission on the recovery effort there, but also to learn from what could be improved should a similar situation happen there or elsewhere in the country. I think it was incredibly devastating. I think there were lessons learned that were applied all over the country. And as devastating as Sandy was, it actually could have been worse. I don't mean that to sound insensitive. It was absolutely horrible. But I think towers have been strengthened, and other cell sites have been hardened even more. And carriers obviously have an incentive to make sure they're hardened. And Sandy was an unusual event in that regard. But there's more for us to learn. I do join my colleagues in cheering the chairman's decision for us to learn more and have these field hearings. hopefully we'll be able to work with industry and consumers to forge some preventative solutions to make sure that future either natural or man-made disasters don't have the same kind of negative effect that Sandy did. But we're not going to be able to regulate away hurricanes that hit in the way that Sandy hit, unlike any time in our lifetimes. And that's going to cause damage. I mean, there was damage of all types to houses, to natural gas infrastructure, to electrical infrastructure. Everything that's natural and man-made was devastated in its wake. And I don't want the expectation to be that somehow a rule at the FCC is going to prevent that from happening. We do need to do all that we can to make it better the next time something like that happens, regardless of where it is. But we also need to keep our expectations realistic.
I have one small but important coda to this. This conversation is taking place in a dynamic industry. Technology is changing, as we suggested earlier in our conversation. The Commission is required by law to submit to Congress next month its recommendations with respect to next generation 911. That's going to be a very important collaboration with Congress and, of course, with the American public, because the existing 911 infrastructure has served us very well, but in an all-IP world, there are very difficult technical, policy, and legal questions that we have to confront as to how we update that infrastructure to meet the needs of the 21st century. So that's something to keep an eye on as well, next month and in the months going ahead.
During the Q&A with the chairman just before this panel, Gary Shapiro asked about the net neutrality dispute in the courts, and it sounded like the chairman was essentially saying that the behavior, the norms within the business community are not as concerning. This is my rewording. Do you agree? Do you agree that there's not really that much example? How important is net neutrality these days?
Can I jump in on that real quick? I'd say he's absolutely right, because there wasn't a problem before the order, and there's not a problem after the order. And that was at the heart of my dissent, that there was not a market failure, and the Commission did not conduct a market study and didn't produce evidence there was any systemic market failure to begin with. So there's an economic incentive to keep the experience as open and freedom-enhancing as possible. And there's a disincentive, especially as we see the rise in wireless broadband, where vast majority of American consumers have a choice of 5 wireless providers, and more, wireless broadband is the fastest growing segment, of course, of the broadband market, plus the added competitive benefit of having unlicensed use in that space, which is another reason I've been in favor of unlicensed use of TV white spaces. So that becomes a check and a balance against this notion that it's purely a duopoly in the broadband market, and somehow there's an economic incentive for ISPs to act in an anti-competitive way, and that other laws wouldn't apply. Other laws would apply if they acted in an anti-competitive way. So there wasn't a problem before, just like there's not a problem now. So to say that the rules produced the no problem scenario is inaccurate, because there wasn't a problem before.
In my engagement, there are a number of individuals who have spoken to me, who are unable, from a financial standpoint, to navigate in this space and to voice their opinions and voice their conditions through our network. It is very expensive for a small entrepreneur to complain within this framework. I have heard of issues, and I think creating a set of rules that fit on one page, high-level rules that affirm that every single one in this room, every single one in this nation has the ability to use a device that's non-harmful to the network, to not expect to be blocked when they are trying to access lawful content, to present their point of view. I think it's justified. So I am confident, as the chair put forth, that the courts will see it in the same way. I am It's noteworthy that about 90 friends of the court, so to speak, weighed in from diverse points of view, Nasuka, Nehru, a lot of members of, persons from the investment community and alike, a whole host, 90 individuals from different walks of life have weighed in and said, this framework, which is nimble, presents and puts forth the certainty we need for both consumers and innovators, for companies and all of us to navigate in this space. I am confident, and I think the commission, the majority of the commission, spoke in the proper voice.
And if the court does not agree?
Then we will make our assessment at this time, but I am confident that the court will agree.
Well, I have no legal crystal ball, but I think the point of any such policy should be this. We need to balance the incentives for deployment of network infrastructure with the incentives for the development of internet applications and services. I think the rules that we have in place are a fair attempt to do that, but we're obviously going to have to revisit these issues in the aftermath of any court decision.
I personally have my doubts as to the nature of the extent of the Commission's legal authority in this area, but of course, as my colleagues have pointed out, that question will be answered in the first instance by the court. Turning to the policy question, though, the essential issue is this. Do you want the FCC to inject itself into a whole panoply of network management decisions made by private broadband providers? If the answer is yes, then you have to have some sort of limiting principle. And for the life of me, I just can't discern one. And that problem is exacerbated when there isn't, as Commissioner McDowell pointed out, a concrete issue, a complaint, some sort of practice that is widespread enough to warrant, in my opinion, commission action. So once you cross that Rubicon, I think we have to be honest with ourselves that that decision does not come without a cost. Obviously, network management providers, application developers, everybody else is going to incorporate that into their decision making. And that is something that I, again, in my view, would simply inhibit investment, hamper innovation, and ultimately redound to the detriment, not to the benefit of consumers.
Do you think do you think data caps will be an issue that the FCC will take up this year at all? And how does the practice, do you think, fit? How do you think that carriers are doing with that practice? Do you see any concerns or not?
Go ahead, you reached first. No, go ahead. You drew first, so you switched first.
Well, I mean, this is a good example of what I just suggested. Once you cross the Rubicon, what is the limiting principle? If you have a user who is downloading a ton of movies from Russia or whatever, and a network management provider decides, well, that person should pay for what he or she is consuming, what should be the FCC's role in deciding whether or not that's an acceptable practice or not, setting aside the legal authority questions. The chairman earlier last year suggested that he thought data caps and usage-based pricing could play a positive, salutary role in alleviating congestion. Later on, he suggested that maybe there might be some concerns with the practice that we should be mindful of. Obviously, all of us agree that consumer protection is important. We agree with some of the principles that Commissioner Clyburn pointed out, that if you're accessing lawful content on a device that doesn't harm the network, that is something that I think every consumer would expect and regulators should respect. But the question is, what is the FCC going to do about, in broad strokes, about usage-based pricing? Again, I find it very difficult for us to figure out a way in which we would insert ourselves into that decision made by private companies without violating the law and without jeopardizing those companies' investment decisions and infrastructure judgments. But I understand that my colleagues might well disagree with me.
I'd just like to build on what Commissioner Pai said, which is with any limited resource in the economy, a market allocates those limited resources through differentiation in pricing, right? So the more you consume of something, for the most part, the more you pay. Consumers are, of course, consuming more and more spectrum, for instance, or just bandwidth in general. So, a bona fide economic analysis will show you with other markets that when you have price regulation and you discourage tiering, you end up seeing prices rise for all players. And who actually gets harmed the most by that are the lower end consumers, those who consume the least, in this case maybe the proverbial grandma who's just sipping bandwidth rather than the guzzler of bandwidth. So when you start limiting pricing freedom, you're going to see less of a resource, and you're going to see prices go up for everybody. And I think that would actually be detrimental. But look, the wireless industry in particular has been a jewel of our economy for a long time. And in part it's been a jewel because many times Congress has chosen to not regulate it very heavily. And I think we need to learn from that. If you look at the 1996 Telecommunications Act, for instance, Congress left wireless out of some of the same requirements it put on other industries. And we saw a tremendous explosion of entrepreneurial brilliance and investment as a result. So let's learn from what has succeeded here. Those who consume a tremendous amount of bandwidth should probably be paying more, just like if you eat more food or consume more gasoline or electricity, you pay more. So keep that in mind and look, learn from history. Look at other instances where the government has stepped in to try to regulate pricing in a competitive market, and you'll see that it actually harms consumers, it does not help them.
Would love to hear from the Dems here on this too, but how do you view this in light of the fact that some of the carriers are doing more upstream selling of their own products? And is that of concern or not, or do you view that in any different way? So you see, for example, the carriers doing their own video streaming services, et cetera.
I actually think that should be encouraged, and we're seeing also more agreements with over-the-top players as a result, because that's what consumers want. So consumers want, for instance, more content. So you're seeing Netflix sign more deals with ISPs, for instance, many just announced in the past few days. So as consumer demand increases and as you have more competition in the last mile, especially wireless, so again, wireless being the fastest growing segment of the broadband market, you're seeing consumers actually benefit. This is an environment where consumers are awash in more choices and better pricing than any other time in human history. And so I think this is a time to celebrate and not a time to try to foist sort of 19th century or 20th century industrial policy on a market that it looks completely different, as we can see on this show floor, from anything human beings have ever seen.
I am often quiet at this point because how I was raised in this regulatory space sometimes is, I don't want to say conflict, sometimes at semi-odds with, I will just say that, as most of you know, I spent quite a few years in state regulation, and what the commissioner put forth, the cost causer pays is what our mantra was. I governed myself in that way. But I hesitate a bit because I always come back to sort of the similarly situated. You mentioned some of the providers that are putting forth and have these options. Some of the conflict, I think, has been whether what counts and whether or not the traffic that is flowing from one source is similarly situated to the other. So I have an open mind as it relates to this framework, which is the traditional regulatory answer when you're dancing a bit. But it is significant, and I am sort of at a regulatory internal frictional crossroads as it relates to some of this. So
ambivalence.
I'll get back to you.
On the one hand, I think those who use more of a resource should pay more. I think that's a fair general proposition. On the other hand, we want to be clear that these types of policies are not set in a way that's anti-competitive, designed to generate fees at the expense of encouraging further network deployment. So I think it's an area we need to monitor. I think all of my colleagues would agree with me that it's changing fast. and the web of relationships that are developing is something we should keep an eye on.
Can we switch gears and talk a bit about competition and competition policy? And again, in the Q&A with the chairman, he talked a little bit about trying to bolster landline competition in more innovative ways. I thought that was interesting. Would love to hear a response on that. And generally, if you think that the communications industry is competitive and what the FCC should do going forward, especially in this year.
Who saw the chairman? Did any of us actually attend the chairman's? Normally I do, but I had a conflict.
I was there.
Okay, so what did he say?
He made a little announcement about Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I heard that.
Right.
I knew that was
He
going to
heard about
happen.
it, yeah.
But
Talked about you.
what?
He did.
But what did he say about competition in landline and wireline?
So he was saying that in wireless is competitive, that the nation was on the doorstep of duopoly. I think you've all heard this before, right? The doorstep of duopoly, but that decisions made in the wireless space, and that decisions made with the AT&T merger and T-Mobile and others have made competition blossom in wireless. Wireline, more concerns, but he said that there may be more things to do to encourage more innovative new entrants into the wireline space. Am I summarizing that correctly?
For
For those who are there? For residential.
Well, part of the conflict in terms of, getting, fiber to the home, and the way things are migrating from a wireline standpoint, I thought I took away that, of course, it's a challenge, with 1/3 plus of us cutting the cord. In DC, I'm guilty of that. And so when you talk about, that type of framework, who's going to go into the business? Again, from a wireline standpoint, and from a wireless standpoint, that's subject for some debate, especially as it relates to, what your options are in rural areas. So I don't know. I'll yield to you, and then talk about you after.
You yield to me. Does that mean I have your proxy for your vote?
No, it does not mean that at all.
So of course I wasn't there. I'm not quite sure what he said. I'll rely on your translation. But let me just blather on for 45 seconds, and then we'll see if that hits the mark. Shotgun methods, what I tried as an undergraduate on my exams, but sometimes they work, sometimes it didn't. So I came from the wireline sector. That was I started off as a young associate representing competitive long distance companies, who then became competitive local exchange carriers. So in the early 2000s actually. The idea of defending something called the Unbundled Network Element Platform, UNIP, was a hot topic. Who here remembers what I'm talking about? Okay, good. So we have a critical mass. Okay, so UNIP. All right. So UNIP was an alternative to resale.
This is
the
the
resale
only room
pricing.
ever you're going to get
I
all
know.
those people raising their hand. Ever.
Things I can't talk about over the Thanksgiving dinner table. But do we need more espresso for everybody? No. But no, real quick. So the idea behind UNIP was to get the long-distance companies, the old AT&T, MCI, and such, to give them an advantage to offer the bundle for residential voice. This is where I'm going. Residential voice. That's why I asked to use a residential commercial that he talked about. And so UNIP became the cornerstone for a lot of business plans, including the big old AT&T long-distance company and MCI and others. And so there was a huge fight all over the place, all over Washington for years on this, when the FCC decided to phase out UNIP under Michael Powell's chairmanship. And then there was a court appeal. Okay. So how many people in the room actually filed something at the DC circuit on that? But anyway, nobody, this is the point, and I've learned, this is a big learning point for me in my career. Nobody on either side of that debate, among the best and the brightest of economists, lawyers, engineers, were talking about or thinking about the rise of cable telephony or wireless as a substitute for residential voice. And that taught me a big lesson, which is we need to be careful about being arrogant about what we know today, thinking it will always be so, and that there's nothing else coming over the horizon. And we have to be, exercise regulatory humility as we go forward, Because what we don't want our policies to do is to snuff out an innovation, because we will never hear about the innovation that was snuffed out. We will hear about the innovations that come. So I think as regulators, we need to be patient to look at the competitive marketplace. When we talk about competition in wireline, I'm not quite sure what he means there. When you look at AT&T's wireline footprint, 75% of their customers have gone someplace else, to cable telephony or to wireless only, as Commissioner Rosenworcel pointed out, with a third of all U.S. households being wireless only, and that number growing. And you have 90% of Americans having a choice of at least five wireless carriers. That's very compelling, and I think any honest antitrust economist or attorney will tell you that's a competitive marketplace right there. So let's be very careful about what we're trying to do. Let's be very careful to avoid trying to pretend we're smarter than the marketplace, because you don't know what's coming over the corner, and you don't want to have our action or Congress's action create some sort of perverse, harmful incentive.
And the only thing I would add to that is in terms of our mandate going forward in terms of consumer protections, in terms of our public safety obligations and the like. So with that, we have to be mindful that there is a regulatory balancing act.
Right. It's really fast, and then we'll get some Q&A going. Commissioner Rosenworcel and Pai. No.
Sure. At the risk of being bipartisan, I think I'd like to associate myself with a lot of what Commissioner McDowell just said, and probably because I also share some of the history of having worked on some of those issues. But I think what's important to remember is we used to think about competition fairly narrowly. We talk about competition within technologies. We now talk about competition between technologies. We talk about services that used to substitute within a specific type of technology, and now we talk about services that can substitute across technologies. Those are really big changes in the ways that we look at communications policy. And I think that we're going to only see more change in the days ahead. What's important to remember, though, is we like competition, not just for competition's sake, but because competition lowers prices and produces more innovative services. And so we always have to remember, even in an evolving market, that the value that comes from competition is it brings lower prices and more innovative services for consumers.
Great. Commissioner Pai?
Can't really improve upon that except to steal Jane Austen's line, these are truths universally acknowledged. So
Right. Let's open it up to some questions from you folks who came out. Don't be shy.
Can you all
identify yourselves, please?
Oh, I'm Kevin. Can each of you respond to this question?
Can you identify yourself and where you're from?
Yeah, Kevin Modest, EMS Networking. Why do the FCC guidelines governing microwave radiation exposure from all wireless not include non-thermal biological effects when thousands of studies show non-thermal effects, including cancer, cardiac dysfunction, immune system disorders, as documented in the Bioinitiative report that was just updated this week?
As you know, there is an item circulating that you have the opportunity to weigh in on. Ever so often, I think every 3 or 4 or so years, we review our rules. We look at in the ecosystem. We have those persons and staff at our offices on and off-site that review this. So you have an opportunity with an item that is available for you to weigh in on, and I encourage you to do that.
Is there anyone else that really wants to contribute to this? Because I'd like to get a few more questions in if possible. But anyone else? Oh, questions.
Recently, the FTC has moved on changes in the Lifeline service, normally working with the poor and urban community relative to access. It's my understanding that now you're looking at expanding that service to include wireless and internet access?
You are referring to the Lifeline reform efforts that we are undertaking, and what that, of course, has attempted to do is to ensure that we are in sync with the way in which the public is communicating. So it includes both a landline and a mobile engagement. It includes some savings and efficiency opportunities that you are aware of in terms of ensuring that there are no duplicates and the like. So I can speak to you a bit, but it is modernizing the framework to ensure that the incentives for those in need, that the way in which they communicate at present, that you don't have to be, if your preferred and most efficient means of communication is a mobile framework, that the assistance that you would qualify for, that follows you. So that is one of the issues. If you ask probably most of us, what are the top 5 things that we're most proud of in terms of that reform framework to ensure that consumers in need have the choice to use this item, their particular preferred framework, and have, if they qualify, have the opportunity to get assistance. I think that's one of the things that we're most proud of.
Howard?
Howard Buskirk with Communications Daily. Officially, the timetable for an incentive auction of broadcast spectrum, we're looking at something like a 2014 auction, but a lot of people think that that's a very aggressive timetable and maybe a little unrealistic. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, when do you think we're going to actually see an auction of the TV spectrum?
You want each of us to answer?
2014. The reply comment, well, the comments are due on the 25th of this month. Reply comments March, right. And there has been and will continue to be ongoing engagement. This is a very dynamic an item. So Howard, I think if there's any opportunity for us to be on target, there are all sorts of incentives and engagement that will, I think, will get us there in that time frame. Yes, it's aggressive. They are working extremely hard, but there are a lot of motivated bodies and participants in this particular docket.
I think, Howard, I don't want to speak for everybody, but we would all love for it to be as soon as possible. I've lived through 2 of the largest spectrum auctions in FCC history, so AWS-1 and 700 megahertz. I know especially 700 megahertz, we actually had industry coming to us asking for delay. There were a lot of twists and turns that weren't foreseen. So while I hope, and will work as hard as I can to make sure it's 2014, folks just realistically need to understand that history tells us that these things can take longer than you hope or expect. And especially when you've got literally the most complicated spectrum auction in world history with the reverse and forward auction and all the rest of it, the repacking, all the rest of it that goes along with this. So just keep that in mind, but we hope it's 2014.
Did you want to answer, Commissioner Usher? Okay, I think we have another question. Do we even have time for any more questions? Sure. One more question.
Hi, well, I've got the microphone. So it's Paul Schrader, American Foundation for the Blind, also a recent member of the Consumer Advisory Committee, which I hope you'll renew. Quick question. So the chairman also talked about people with disabilities and accessibility with Mr. Shapiro. And I'm wondering, in a platitude-free way, if you would talk about how vigorously the FCC should be enforcing accessibility, because it doesn't seem as though the FCC really has been enforcing accessibility under previous laws prior to the Communications and Video Accessibility Act.
That's a great point. I think what's really exciting right now is we have the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. This is a new law. As you know, over the last 2 years, we've done a lot to try to put things in place, from closed captioning to the reintroduction of video description to talking about emergency access. And so I think as we enter the next phase, the challenge will be to make sure that the rules we put in place are rules that we enforce. And we're going to have to work with you and industry and individuals in the disabilities community to make sure that you help us by pointing out any places where you think our policies fall short or where our failure to enforce will result in practices that are not acceptable under the law.
And in terms of that ACTS implementation, we have not missed a deadline.
Okay, really fast. Let's just go down the line. The most exciting thing you've seen at CES, just really fast. Like, really, no more than 5 words, I'm telling you.
Oh, no.
3D printing. I'm the son of a urologist, and to see a device that can print out kidneys that can be transplanted blows my mind.
To be repetitive, 3D printing, because I think it has the potential to do really incredible things for American manufacturing.
3D dual screen engagement. I love it.
Gosh, there's so much. You actually, Ajit did read my mind. That when we saw it together, when we learned together that the 3D printer actually is manufacturing kidneys from stem cells that can then be transplanted. That sounds like science fiction. That was absolutely phenomenal. It has nothing to do with wireless policy or communications policy, but it's really cool. So.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Ajit Pai, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, and Commissioner Robert McDowell for joining us. And thank you all for coming.